This video is part 2 of Chapter 13, Communication in Psychology, for PSY 222, Research Methods in the Psychological Sciences. In part 2, we're going to continue with our tour of the structure of research reports, which you should be diligently putting together this week for your first draft of your research report. We left off with just the basics of how introductions are structured. Now we look at the method, and here's where the subsections will vary sometimes depending on the nature of the research and the particular norms of the journal that you may be writing for. What I'm presenting here and what I had you do for your worksheet is the typical structure, kind of the base structure of a method section. The purpose of a method section is to basically provide in as much detail as necessary for a replication how the study was conducted. The basic structure typically includes a participant section where you give description of who the participants were, a materials section, in some journals that's called an apparatus section, and then a procedure. Now, I've asked you to include a very short section called design. In some journals, procedure and design are combined. In some journals, the design section isn't there at all. In still other journals, it's its own separate section. I've had you include it because it tends to be a part of the basic formula for how method sections are constructed. You'll even notice in the document that I provided you, the annotated sample paper, the headings within the method section are not the same as the base that I've described for you before. So there is tremendous variability from one journal to the next. Just remember, we're asking you to do the base model of the requirements of what needs to go in a method section. In the participant section, as you've learned from the method worksheet that I had you do, you typically have to include at the very least the total number of participants, their major demographic attributes, procedures for how you recruited participants, were they compensated in any way, if you used conditions of an experiment, how many were in each condition, and you're also expected, if you lose participants over the course of a study, that you explain how many were lost and why, or if you had to exclude participants for some reason. For instance, in research that I've done, if subjects don't complete an a priori decided number of items on a questionnaire, I remove them from my survey research. Materials and procedure sections, again, there's some variability in how materials are described from one journal to the next. Materials, you have to think of it as the ingredients list from a recipe. Any materials, including references, citations for those materials. For example, in your research reports, you need to give a citation and include in your references the original authors of the scales that were used in the data collection that you're describing in your paper. I also asked you to include a section called design. Your authors in your textbook don't describe that, but I include it because it is included in many journals. The procedure section, think of that as the actual instructions for baking. You know, what items you put in first, and do you stir or do you whisk? It's exactly like that. You know, in the materials, that's the ingredient list. The procedure is how do you put the dish together and actually cook it. Remember that your job in this section of the paper is to give your reader enough details that were they so motivated, they could do pretty much an exact replication of your work. The results sections, and I know that worksheet was a struggle, a big one. what you're doing with your results section is providing just the results of your study. You're wanting to show how you answered the research questions that you proposed in the introduction section, and how you tested the hypotheses that you proposed also in the introduction section. You have to stick to the facts. You don't provide an interpretation of the data. That's for the discussion section. Typically what you're going to do, and you can add subheadings to improve clarity if you want to. Typically what you do is you state what was the purpose of the analysis. Sometimes that can be saying, in order to test the hypothesis, a Pearson product moment correlation was conducted, and then you go on and describe the results. You are expected to present any relevant descriptive statistics and give a verbal description of the pattern of those descriptives. For example, if you're doing a t-test to compare means, you're going to present the mean and the standard deviation for each group and describe verbally which group appears to have the higher mean, and then you present the actual t-test results. The newer standards are really encouraging writers to include, in addition to p-values and statistical test results, they want us now to include confidence intervals, effect sizes, to back up our inferential test results. And then you are expected to draw a conclusion, not an interpretation, but a conclusion. For example, if you did detect a significant t-test value, you are to say there was a significant difference in means. The mean for group 1 was higher than the mean for group 2. The effect size was moderate. That's a conclusion. The discussion section is designed to give you a chance, and I often believe that the discussion section is where you are allowed to be a little more creative, a little more inventive, because you have to come up with explanations, reasons for why you found what you found. The temptation among students is to simply repeat their description of the findings and have that suffice as the discussion. You do give the essential findings. You don't repeat your entire results section, though. You then present the connection between your findings and the research you presented in the introduction section, drawing comparisons. Were your findings consistent with previous research? Were they inconsistent with previous research? And when you're doing this, you have to explain why you think that is. You know, if you find a correlation between two things, that is a significant positive relationship, what are some possible interpretations of that relationship between variables? If you find a mean difference between two groups, what are the possible explanations for that finding? If your hypotheses are not supported and they're not consistent with previous research, why do you think that is? Finally, you do want to talk about what were some of the limiting factors in your research. You know, for your semester project, it's not really your research. You're doing a secondary data analysis to get some real world practice in a very not real world environment. You've got a pre-supplied data set and you're playing with it and getting some experience how to put these ideas together. Were you writing about your own research, you would talk about, you know, what are the limits of the method. If you're doing a correlational study, you talk about the fact that you cannot draw cause and effect conclusions. And one of the things that you might do in later research is to do take an experimental approach to try and tease out those causal pathways, or do a more sophisticated correlational analysis that can speak to some of those causal relationships a little more directly. This last portion of giving specific ideas for additional research, it is important because at the end of the process, you really are suggesting to other researchers what still needs to be done to advance the science further, and what might you do to advance the science further. I often encourage my senior research students, when they're looking at their literature, make sure you read the last paragraph of every article, because that's where the researchers say, here are the questions that are critical to this area of research. Here's what we still need to ask. And that can really be a good guideline for your own work, and questions you might ask in your research. The reference page is probably something that I know I spend more time than I wish I had to spend making corrections to students' reference pages. They're tedious, they're irritating, they're obnoxious. I don't know what other synonyms to use there, but it's worth your time to learn the process of putting these reference pages together and doing them properly. If you look at the reference page, one change from the APA 6 to 7, the word references. We do not use the phrase works cited. We don't say sources, we say references. It's bold. It is not underlined. It is centered. Every reference that you include, and your reference list should be in alphabetical order according to the first author, and it's the first author's last name. Unlike MLA, we do not spell out author names. We use the last name, initials for first and middle names if middle names are provided. We do not include degrees like PhD or MA. We don't include that information. The references are in author date format, meaning what's the most important. If I'm reading a research report, I want to know who did the work and when was it published. That's what's most critical for scientific writing. We want to know who and we want to know when. The order of these author names is significant. It means the first author is the person who had the greatest contribution to the work. The second author had the second greatest contribution. The third author had the third greatest contribution, and so on. So that order is meaningful, and you are not to change it. We give great respect to the first author, and the order of those names is significant. We use what's called a hanging indent. If you haven't learned in Microsoft Word how to do a hanging indent, you should figure it out, because it will save you loads of time in the future. One major change in the last decade is the addition of what are called DOI numbers. These are a way of finding a source in an internet form that becomes relatively permanent for your reader. The key thing about reference pages is you want your reader to be able to look at that page and go, okay, I want to find that original article. I want to read it. DOIs mean they can just click on it. It is a website address. Now, the expectation is that you give an actual clickable website address. So it should start with https:// and then the doi.org address that's provided. Make sure that you do not put a period after it. The period after it will stop it from being a live link. The structure of the references for journal articles is very standard. You have the author names. If you have multiple authors, the last name is separated with an ampersand. The year is put in parentheses. There's a period after the year. The title of the article is in sentence case, which means only the first word or any proper nouns is capitalized. If there's a colon in the title, the first word after the colon is also capitalized. If there's a question mark at the end of a title, you don't put an additional period, you just leave the question mark. Journal titles are italicized. In the the 7th edition of the APA manual, I'm not going to go any further in terms of specifics about references. They've made changes to some of the fine-grained details of references, and you should look carefully at the reference examples that were provided to you in the APA 7 handout that's called Reference Examples, and try to follow them to the letter. I gave you feedback like that in your worksheet 1 and in your worksheet 2, or not 2, was 2? Yeah, worksheet 1 and 2. I gave you specific feedback whenever you provided me with a reference telling you how to do things properly. It would be very helpful to me if you paid attention to that feedback. Now, I mentioned before, you're not going to be expected to do footnotes in your research report, but when people do submit professional journal articles, manuscripts to journals, they often do have footnotes. They tend, if you're presenting original research, they're fairly rare, but they can occur. Sometimes they include things like copyright permissions or permission to use certain kinds of materials like photographs or images of other kinds. Then you can have sometimes content footnotes, which are designed to be helpful to a reader, and they're seen as supplementary to the article that you've had published. The footnotes are collected, they're put on a separate page, they're typically after the references. We do not do footnotes at the bottom of pages. It's a printing nightmare. It's difficult for manuscript preparers. It's easier for the journal submission if the footnotes are collected on a page by themselves, and then the professional editors will do the heavy lifting of inserting them into a document for publication. When appendices are required, and again, these are rare in published research reports, sometimes you'll see them if someone is doing an article where they are talking about the validation of a questionnaire. You will see an appendix that includes the actual questionnaire. But otherwise, appendices are pretty rare in research journals. In class projects, though, they may be required. In senior research, for example, in both, if I ask for a research proposal or in the research report that students in PSY 405 have to produce, I do ask that they put all of their data collection materials like questionnaires, consent forms, debriefing forms, and their IRB submission in the appendix of their report. After the references in your research report will be any tables or figures that you choose to use. And I have provided you with a video explanation of how to make tables in Microsoft Word. Hopefully it is helpful to you. Tables are remarkably uninteresting to look at in APA style. They are not intended to be pretty or interesting. They are intended to be very clear and easy to read. We only put one table or figure on a single page, and those are at the end of your manuscript. They're after the references. And there are specific guidelines for how to create titles for tables and figures as you present them. Now again, your book, Shaughnessy, was published before the 7th edition of the APA manual came out. If you see things in your textbook that look different from the sample paper that I've provided you, it's because there were updated changes. Please go with the examples that are provided for you on D2L. Now, while you're not being asked to write a research proposal here, it doesn't mean that you will never have to write one. Research proposals are often expected of graduate level students. So if in a master's program or a dissertation program, a PhD program, you will have to propose your master's thesis, you will have to propose your dissertation research. And what you will be doing when you write those proposals is building an argument for the importance of your question, reviewing literature related to your question, proposing a set of hypotheses based on that literature, and then you'll map out exactly how are you going to collect the data, what kind of analyses are you going to run to test your hypotheses. You're going to provide some expectations about the pattern of results that you expect and how the interpretation is going to be conducted. The goal of a research proposal is to ensure you submit this to other people who are going to look at your proposal and evaluate it to determine whether it's an appropriate piece of work for the level of education that you're pursuing. And they're going to provide you with advice about methodology, about tools and techniques. And they're also going to ensure that the work is going to be of scientific merit, that it's going to be valuable and lead to appropriate results. Research proposals are typically constructed with these basic components to them: an introduction, a method, some kind of data analysis plan, and a discussion of expected results, some conclusions, references, appendices that typically involve any kind of data collection instruments, questionnaires, consent forms, debriefing forms, and such, and information about the IRB review process. And that concludes my coverage of communication and psychology for Chapter 13.